We're in Edward Street and we are today doing a series of recordings at the MacArthur Museum. And at the street level there are two plaques, one the general plaque and then another one which celebrates the 75th anniversary of MacArthur arriving in Brisbane. And as you're going to see in a minute, it is a quite spectacular museum. You see reception, get the lift upstairs to level 8, and then depending, either the door will be open or alternatively you open the door and get access. And the museum just in there. Good morning, John.
Good morning. How are
really
you?
Well.
Welcome.
Thank
to
you
MacArthur
so much for
Museum.
the invitation to come and record, do a podcast here. So if you can just, first of all, just give us a bit of a feel about the entrance area here. I've already done a bit on the footpath and a bit coming in.
Well, we might look at this first of all, because this is taken of MacArthur on the Atherton tablelands, and he's inspecting a guard of honour from the 9th Division that has returned from the Middle East, and you have there the commander of the 9th Division, Major General George Wooten, and Major Malloy, who had been decorated with the DSO for his actions in the Middle East, and he's the guard commander.
So this is one of the very first photos of him in Australia, or it was just chosen because
because the 9th Division came back after El Alamein.
Okay. Yep.
So we're talking about 1943 now.
Very good. So one of the things that's always intrigued me is, and I know we can't photograph it, is the painting of MacArthur, which I think is on loan from the
Australian War Memorial, yes.
So just tell us a little bit about that, and we'll leave that as a really good hook why people should visit it, because they're not ever going to see it on a YouTube, a podcast, a short, or anywhere at all.
Yes, well, essentially the painting was not painted in the contemporary time frame of the event. The event occurred in 1942, and the original was a photograph, not a painting. And the photograph actually had three prominent figures. You had on the left of the painting was General Douglas MacArthur, and he was somewhat less formally dressed than he is in the painting. In the centre was General Sir Thomas Blamey, and on the right-hand side was Major General W. Allen. And the painting there was actually done during the Vietnam era, and the artist was trying to portray his view of the relationship between Australia and the US, and therefore in the painting Allen is standing pretty much to attention while he gets his orders from MacArthur, whereas in fact it was a much more relaxed atmosphere with mugs of tea or coffee and leaning on their sticks and that sort of thing. So a very, very different sort of image at all, but it's, the artist has taken a fair bit of artistic license.
And that's really one of the wonderful things about the museum here, is that it is so full of historical tidbits of really important information that just make it such a unique asset to Brisbane in my mind. And it's the reason why I think that when you look to the title of the Allied capital of Australia. Brisbane really does deserve that title for that World War II period, because it was the Allied capital.
Yes, well, I mean, we had American, Australian, British, Dutch.
Right, so let's move on. So before we leave the foyer area, John's just going to tell us a little bit about this painting, which is by a very famous Australian artist. So that means the painting is of a famous person, but by a famous artist. And I understand it has an interesting little caption to the side there.
Yeah, well, this portrait was done in about 1942 by Sir William Dargie. Now, Sir William Dargie was probably Australia's foremost portrait painter. He won the Archibald Prize, which is the premier portraiture prize for Australia, 8 times, and that's a record that is highly unlikely to ever be beaten. But it was done by of MacArthur. MacArthur himself wasn't particularly happy with the portrait, because apparently he felt that it made him look too old. Now, MacArthur generally is portrayed with his hat to hide a little balding patch at the back, which he was a bit sensitive about. But the other thing, interestingly, down here, the caption here reads, "Your commander to Doug, from Bill Dargie." Now, there was some thought that maybe Dargie, in his capacity, was on first name terms with MacArthur. However, it turns out that apparently there was a US naval officer on MacArthur's staff who had the first name of Douglas as well. And so this portrait is not to Douglas MacArthur, about Douglas MacArthur, and given to one of his staff of the name of Douglas. And so the little caption there, and people for some time thought that in fact this was given directly to MacArthur, but it is not so.
And is that the museums, or is it on loan?
No, it's the museums. We have 2.
So how does the museum come to have this one?
This one, this one was donated by Tim Fairfax.
A very incredibly generous ex-Melbourneite, now Queenslander. Yeah, incredible. So while we're on generous philanthropic gifts, I believe that Tim Fairfax also gifted this particular new dimension to the displays up here.
Yes, indeed. He sponsored with a donation, he sponsored this as a combination of a digital display with a physical display, and related, both of them related to the prisoners of war of the Japanese in the Pacific campaign. And it shows you the spread of prisoners of war camps that go basically from what was the Dutch East Indies right through to some of the camps in Japan towards the end of the war, and what was then known as Formosa. So there were very widespread of camps for Allied prisoners of war.
And it's a particularly horrific chapter of the World War II, because the treatment of a lot of these prisoners of war was just absolutely atrocious.
Certainly that is the case, and you will get some idea of that, particularly from the digital display here.
Yeah, just a fantastic addition. The Fantastic. So what I find particularly fascinating with modern museums is that they are always on the lookout of going and having a look inside their collections to then bring out a new fresh narrative which they can then put on display that keeps people coming back, which is really incredibly important. And what struck me about this particular display is the name of all the currencies glued together. Give us an update of what this magical bit of history is.
This is known as a short snorter, and the idea of that was that where you had, and in this case it's a group of military journalists, and the idea was that to join this little club you had to take a banknote, sign it, and then you added it to the group list, and then when you got together again you had to show your contribution to that snorter. And if you didn't have the evidence with you, then you had to shout the bar.
Aha, well that is just such a wonderful circular story, just absolutely incredible. Thank you for that one. Now as we move around the museum there are a lot of historical points. Now some of them are not necessarily direct links, but this Code Breakers is a very interesting Australian story, but next to it, as you're going to see in a minute, is an even more fascinating story that does relate to code breaking. John, over to you.
Yes, well, this is the portside control yoke of the Betty Bomber. Now the Betty Bomber had two of these, and this particular one was carrying Admiral Yamamoto, the commander of the Japanese combined fleet.
And he was important because he was critically involved in Pearl Harbor, wasn't he?
Yes, he was the architect of the attack on Pearl Harbor. He was the one who was charged with the responsibility of destroying the US Pacific Fleet. And he reviewed the initial plans, Japanese plans for that operation, and came to the conclusion that the best way of achieving that was in a surprise attack. And so he studied quite seriously a number of different aspects, and the British attack on Taranto, and came to the conclusion that an attack on the US fleet in Pearl Harbor was the solution. And so while it wasn't quite as successful as he had hoped, it didn't catch the US aircraft carriers in port, it did give Japan a period of breathing space when they didn't have to worry about the US Pacific Fleet. Now, consequently, he was public enemy number one to the Americans, or pretty close to it. And so an opportunity arose then in April of 1943 when an intercept, which was received by a number of different stations around the Pacific, but the main ones were linked into Fromell, which was the fleet radio base in Melbourne, a combined Australian and US operation, and also the US Pacific Fleet headquarters in Hawaii. Between them, they decrypted a Japanese naval signal which had the outline of an itinerary for Admiral Yamamoto, who was going on a morale building tour of Japanese fortifications and bases in the Southwest Pacific. The intercept gave time and place, and all sorts of other details which enable the Americans to plot whereabouts he would be at a certain time, and this allowed them to intercept that aircraft and shoot it down. And subsequent to that, the next day, the Japanese army arrived at the scene and took Admiral Yamamoto's body away. There were a couple of post-mortems after it. The second one was a secret one because it showed that he had been killed instantly during the aircraft being shot down. Aircraft crashed and it was left in the jungle for many years. In May of 1969, a group comprising a patrol officer and interested other locals, plus members of 183 Recon Flight of the Australian Army Aviation Regiment, visited the site, and the Aviation Regiment removed the two control yokes and partly the aircraft identification on the wing. And so this then went back to the portside one. This one went to 183 Recon Flight. The other went to a local museum, aviation museum in New Guinea. It subsequently has disappeared, but eventually 183 donated this portside control yoke to this museum.
And one of the incredible things I find that, so Yamamoto ended up as public enemy number one, as you said, however, not 100% entirely justified, because the intent was that the declaration of war was meant to be made before the bombing. And if I remember the story correctly, it was a delay in the encryption and coding in the Washington Japanese diplomatic corps that caused the ambassador to actually roll up with the declaration of war after the bombing had started. Is that correct recollection?
Yes, that's basically true. Yeah. Yes. Whether the matter of a couple of hours would have made a great deal of difference, it would be interesting to know. But the raid was quite devastating, but not as devastating as they'd hoped. One of the reasons for that is that, and that's I mentioned the raid on Taranto. The raid on Taranto by the British Mediterranean Fleet sank 3 Italian ships in port, battleships in port. But 2 of those were refloated within about 7 months. The last one never returned to service. They sank to the bottom, but most of their superstructure, etc., was still sticking out of the water, very much the same as at Pearl Harbor. The thing the Japanese learnt from that is that the torpedoes alone are not sufficient to destroy a battleship. And that's where they came up with the idea of using armour-piercing battleship shells with fins on them in an attempt to destroy the ship by going through the relatively light armoured decks of interwar battleships. And that's exactly what happened to the USS Arizona when a bomb penetrated close to the 2 forward turrets and went straight through into the magazine.
And obliterated it effectively.
Yeah, and very lucky, I think it was the USS Nevada, was supposed to go into dry dock and had therefore had all the stores, including ammunition, removed when a bomb did the same thing to it, went into one of the magazines.
Yeah, just
but
incredible.
there was, of course, nothing there.
Right, another great chapter concluded. Let's move on to the MacArthur office. And John's just going to, over the last 3 or 4 years, gone through a meticulous restoration. And John, over to you.
Well, in fact, it's been through a number of stages, and that's been determined very much by the availability of finance to do the job. because these jobs are very expensive these days. And so we've got a number of areas. First of all, we had a restoration of some of the metalwork. Then,
which would be the metalwork?
It's basically on the
windows
and the doors and that sort of thing, the metalwork. And then we did the timber work in the panels around the walls of the office.
So we're now going to better focus. We've changed location, as you can see, and we're now going to talk about the walls.
Yeah, and in particular, we're looking at the what is called bookmarking, which is a woodworking technique which relies on the different light striking the panels here. Now, what we can see here is that there's a light colour and a dark colour, a dark colour and a light colour, and behind that is a piece of plywood. And the plywood then has affixed to it a veneer, and that veneer is actually, the way it works is that the timber for the veneer is sliced in half. When you open it up, and that's where it gets the name bookmarking, the image on this side is the mirror image of the grain on the other side. And so depending upon the angle that you view it from, the colours give the appearance of changing, while of course this is not really the case. It's the reflected image or the reflected grain appears to be different.
And that was a particular style of timber work from the 1930s or earlier, or
1530s probably. If you look at some of the big manor houses of England and that sort of thing, the Elizabethan era, you would see the large houses would probably have heaps of this sort of in the interior. But it's very labour intensive. The other thing about it is that while it gives the impression of changing over when you view it from one side or the other, when you look at it straight on, the colours blend into the single colour, and then you see quite clearly the diamond shape.
And I can see that here because that looks exactly the same, but there it's sort of dark on that side and light on this side. Incredible. Yeah. But the AMP Society, they had done this already for this building?
Oh yes.
Yeah, so
this building was to be, as Sir Anthony Gordon, the chairman of AMP, said at the time of the official opening on the 2nd of March 1934, that this building was going to reflect the status of the AMP as one of the great financial institutions of the British Empire. So, and they didn't skim. Indeed, there is a theory that the pinstriping here was not actually gold paint, but gold leaf.
wow. So next we'll talk about Washington.
Yes.
So we moved again, and this has always intrigued me. Tell me the story about Washington.
Well, before we do, this one is actually the first portrait. It's significant, and it's only an extract of a much larger one. But it's significant because it was the first of numerous portraits of George Washington that followed. But this was the first with him out of uniform. All the earlier ones were in his uniform as a general of the fledgling United States Army. But the story as far as the MacArthur era is concerned is that when MacArthur arrived at his headquarters here for the first time in July, the 23rd of July 1942, one of his staff officers is supposed to have asked him or suggested to him, so we should put a portrait of the President up there. Now, to understand MacArthur's response, the President of that day, Franklin D. Roosevelt, was of course Democrat. MacArthur had from the early 1950s been toying with the idea of the Republican nomination for 1944. And
so when you say 1950s, you actually mean 1930s or 1920s?
1930s.
1930s.
When MacArthur was Army Chief of Staff, there was what was called the bonus marches, and in short, they were people asking for money. They hadn't had it approved by Congress, so they marched on Washington. MacArthur was told by the President, remove them, get them out of Washington, and so he brings in the tanks and cavalry on horse with swords and infantry with bayonets, and he drives them out. And there are a few of the right-wing Republicans who think this is our man, and so they encourage him to nominate. Although he said he wouldn't nominate, he had to be impressed by the man, the majority of the people.
Didn't want competition?
No, he didn't want any competition. No.
Sounds like Trump actually, doesn't it? Anyway, so that's the story behind it.
And so what happens when he's asked that is he apparently turns on the staff officer and says, no, I'm not having any Democrat looking down on me. And that was it.
All right.
Purely coincidentally, there was another portrait over on this wall, and that was of Abraham Lincoln, and must be coincidental that Lincoln was also a Republican.
Very interesting. All right, we'll move on.
Well, do you want to have a look at the chair?
So, John, I'm very glad you pointed this chair out, because you're right, I actually haven't seen it before. I should be more attentive to your guidance and directions. So can you tell us the story about this new addition to the furniture in the room?
Yes, well, basically, when MacArthur arrived in July of 1942, he was inheriting the furniture from the AMP. There just hadn't been time between the decision to move from Melbourne, which was the result essentially of the victory at Midway, and there hadn't been time to take over the building, clear out the furniture and put new furniture in. So they simply took over all the AMP furniture. But in 1943, in about July of 43, there was a refurbishment. And at that stage, this chair was moved into the office and formed one of the two chairs, visitors' chairs, we see in the museum at the moment.
These are the replicas, but that's an original.
This is an original. They're different.
You're slightly right. Well, I mean...
Yeah, no, they're a different style. That was the bank style, and this is a more casual style. And so this was one of the two chairs here. This chair would have either had MacArthur sitting in it, or maybe somebody like John Curtin, Australian Prime Minister, Admiral Chester Nimitz.
Halsey? And Halsey?
Yes, Halsey, Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Who's who?
Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, when he came out here as a Naval Reserve Lieutenant Commander.
When he was a senator, wasn't he?
He was a senator as well, but he was also a Naval Reserve, yes. And so what happened with this chair is that it stayed here until 1946, when this headquarters was closed down and all the stuff moved out either to archives in the US and Australia, and the furniture was disposed of. This chair went to the US Consul General's office in Brisbane. However, in 1953, the US Consul General's office in Brisbane closed. There simply wasn't enough interaction between US commerce and Brisbane at that stage. So it closed, and at that stage, the chair was put up for auction at Isles Love, and in September 1953, and a fellow called Barry Cooper actually purchased it, and he purchased it for £30, which was considered to be an outrageous amount of money to spend. But he was apparently an accountant and a bit of a furniture collector at Sandgate, and he decided it was worth the effort to have that particular piece of history. Now, it remained in his family until late last year when his daughter donated it to the museum.
I would think history will be forever grateful for that donation.
Yeah, I think so too.
I agree. Thank you so much. Now, in the museum there is one particular item that I have a great love of, and that's the little blue painting. And I will talk to that separately, and the connection right at this present stage is to the centaur. And John, if you can give us the fuller history of the centaur, because I was surprised to learn some of the details in our earlier chat in your office. Over to you.
Well, this is a poster that was produced by the ironically named Department of Information, because while this does actually give information, it also is a source of disinformation. Now, the source of information is fairly straightforward. This is a hospital ship. It's clearly marked white hull, green stripe, red cross. It's steaming on a straight course, and it's lit. It's not blacked out at all. Indeed, they were supposed to be having a little party at one stage earlier in the night. And then in the early hours of the morning, about just after 4 o'clock, it was hit by a torpedo. It was hit by a torpedo. In this illustration, the torpedo struck on the starboard side, just forward of the bridge, which was also an unlucky hit from the point of view that the Centaur was a converted freighter, and therefore that area was originally a very large void. A couple of metal decks had been inserted there and beds placed there to fulfill its role as a hospital ship, but it was still a very large void which filled with water very quickly and accounted for the fact that the Centaur sank very quickly. So that was the information. Obviously, the submarine that fired that torpedo would have had to have been some distance further out to sea from that. And that was exactly the impression that it was supposed to create. However, the torpedo actually struck on the port side, and therefore, as the Centaur was steaming from Sydney towards Port Moresby, hit on the port side means that the submarine that fired it must be much closer to the shore. And that was something that the authorities did not want to get out, because it was believed that this would create considerable alarm in Brisbane, that a Japanese submarine could actually operate so close to Brisbane. And that wasn't the only issue there, because the Japanese submarine surfaced for a period afterwards looking for survivors. And the final the final embarrassment really was the fact that the survivors of the centre weren't picked up until about 30 hours after the torpedo strike. And so all in all, it wasn't a very good look for the local anti-submarine defences of the what was a major port.
Because it was struck, what, about 15 miles off the top end of Cape Morton?
Well, it's supposed to have been, I think David Mann said it was about, I think the centre's on the bottom, somewhere a bit over 20 nautical miles
20, yeah.
due east of Redcliffe.
Mm.
Yeah.
And they only, not that long ago, 20 odd years, discovered it in its relatively deep location.
Yes, it was also in a crevice. And the earlier sonar wasn't able to discriminate all the surface of the ocean floor to the extent that it tended to skim over where it was on the earlier types of sonar, and didn't give that sort of impression of ups and downs as much as the one that David Mearns had.
Yeah, just an incredible story. Okay, well, with that, we'll say goodbye and good evening almost now in this podcast. John, thank you so much for your very generous allocation of time. In the course of this podcast, we've identified several important donations by extraordinarily generous benefactors. And in this concluding bit, I just thought I'd highlight a small donation that our family, the Racy family, has made. And you'll see in the picture, the small insert to the right-hand side, my son, now about 15 years ago, handing over the painting that my mother had painted of the crate. It was painted about 1982 when I worked at the Beenleigh Rum Distillery, and the importance at the time was that when the crate left Singapore Harbour, they celebrated their success by having a tot of Beenleigh overproof rum. An interesting little story. And with that, I'll say goodbye and thank you for watching.